Greetings, workers, peasants, and petty bourgeois intellectuals. My name is Jean Badgeland, in for Jason Miles on this very special episode of This is Revolution. Now, before we begin the show, before I bring my co-host in, and before we bring our guest in, I would just like to remind people to like and subscribe to the videos if you can, and if you have the inclination and you wish to support Jason Miles in his endeavor to bring you more and more content, please consider supporting This is Revolution on Patreon. You'll find all the links and everything in the description. And one final thing, always feel free to leave a comment. Jason reads the comments, and when you leave a mean one, he talks to us for about 3 or 4 hours about how angry he is about this mean comment, and we have to tell him it's like one comment person. And if you're commenting in the comments, you're not winning at life. Anyway, that being said, we do welcome all comments. So without further ado, let me bring on my co-host for the day. It is the one, the only, Stefan Bertram-Lee. Hey, Stefan, how are you doing?
I'm good. What emotions are you feeling right now, Gene? Because that's the topic of the day.
I am feeling a lot of different emotions at the moment. I'm feeling good emotions. I'm feeling bad emotions. I'm feeling negative things in my mind. Maybe I'm worried about something at work, and maybe that means I'm depressed. Maybe I'm concerned about the future of my
You think
children.
your university has a duty of care towards you? Do you think they should be getting involved in these issues?
That's a good question. I think my university thinks they have a duty of care towards me, but deep down they don't have a duty of care towards me. And we all know that they don't have a duty of care towards me. But I'm totally fine about that because you know what? I just want to go to work, do my job, and come home. I don't want
Get some money.
Get some money. You know, it's really amazing nowadays in the economy where like you have to do a job, but you can't just do the job and say like when you apply for the jobs, like I would like this job because I like money and this is a job that I can do. You have to say like I'm very enthusiastic about, I don't know, industrial asbestos removal. It's been my lifelong ambition to
Right, and it's not just for academics. Like my friend works in tech in Canada, and he has to go to like land acknowledgements and stuff.
Land acknowledgement. Well, Canada is is the home of the land acknowledgement, right? They're really bringing back that blood and soil nationalism, right?
Oh yeah, this bit of dirt has belonged to these people forever and will forever belong to them.
I mean, we can, I always find it so funny is like we can admit and we can be quite honest about like the history of genocidal policies towards Native Americans without doing silly things like land acknowledgements. But that's just me. Apparently, I was in a department meeting a while back, and we were discussing hiring for a historian of Native American history, and one of the things you do is you look at all the other adverts for those positions, see what people include in the adverts and things. And apparently like tons of them just have like land acknowledgements. Like this university was built on, it's like, what? You doing land acknowledgements in your like hiring in your like job advert? That's like some crazy stuff. Anyway, talking about Native Americans, we have the one and only revolutionary of the reservation. She is the Native American known as Dances with Truckers. She is the one, the only Ashley Frawley. How you doing, Ashley?
I am way too white for that that opening. Definitely, you can tell. Like, yeah,
well, Dances with Truckers. That's why you're known as Dances with Truckers, right? It's like in between those two worlds. It's like Dances with Wolves, which was on the TV the other day. I went into a bar with my friend Patrick, and we saw Dances with Wolves, and I was like, "How the fuck did this movie win an Oscar? It's like so terrible. It's a terrible movie."
That would be a fun game to play, like the worst film that's ever won an Oscar.
Yeah, one of the craziest things that I heard was like in Purple Rain was nominated for an Oscar and it didn't win the Oscar for like best soundtrack. So it's like, who the hell won the Oscar for best soundtrack in 1984. Like, what's better than Purple Rain? But enough Purple Rain. Ashley, we are here to talk to you about one of your favorite topics, which is emotions. And you have a forthcoming book. When is the book coming out?
Well, I messed something up. I tried to get away with submitting a graph in the manuscript that I published somewhere else, which is a big no-no, but sometimes you can get away with it. And I got busted, so I had to redo the graph. And all the data that I used was gone, wasn't available anymore.
Oh, no.
And because I thought, I'll just update the graph, right? But there was the recent data wasn't comparable. So it was a big nightmare. So it took me like 7 days of my life that I'll never get back, like 12 hours a day. Anyway, and that
making a graph.
What's that?
We should show everyone that you should evidence with vibes and not graphs.
It's funny. I could have just used Google Ngram and like literally just done like the exact same graph just with Google Ngram because it does match up, but whatever. Anyway, so it took ages, and then that took me, that pushed the book off schedule a little bit. But it should come out this year, I assume. It's now in proof stage, so hopefully by the end of the year.
The title is
Significant Emotions, Rhetoric, and Social Problems in a Vulnerable Age. So catchy. I'm very good at catchy titles.
That's well, Significant Emotions is good. Then you can put anything else in the subtitle. So Significant Emotions is discussing, it's a book that is discussing the politicization, I would say, of emotion. Would that be like a kind of a good meta description of what that book, what you're writing about?
It's a bit difficult. It's a bit difficult because you could say it's a politicization of emotion, or you could say it's a depoliticization through the language of emotion. So by transforming problems into a wide range of problems into emotional problems, they lose some of their political edge. They become significant insofar as they hurt people emotionally. And how you define a problem invites a particular set of solutions. So if the main issue with like fees, for instance, student fees in university, is that it causes distress, mental distress, this very broad kind of term that advocates will use, then the solution is, mental health support for this mental distress. And this leads to the absurd situation that I describe in one of the last chapters, where you have people saying that one of the main causes of a so-called mental ill health epidemic, they say mental health epidemic, which makes no sense, but a mental ill health epidemic in universities is financial stresses. It is necessary to keep fees high. We need to be very careful about any kind of campaign to reduce fees, because then we can't get the support to students who need it, right? So the fees are the cause of mental health problems, but the fees pay for the professionals to deal with the mental health problems, which, by the way, you can't access anyway.
So it's the cause, but also the solution. But I mean,
so that's a good example of a depoliticization. So that was a very politically fraught issue. If anybody remembers, maybe you were students, as I was, when the fees were introduced, and we rioted at that time. It was a big issue, and now someone like Sam Gyimah, conservative minister, can say that mental health is a bigger issue than fees, and nobody bats an eye.
So I mean, like, mental health really has become a kind of political, and this is why I say it's a politicization. It's become a political explanation and solution to all kinds of social problems. I mean, I guess the equivalent in the United States would be, obviously, every time there's gun violence, you have one side wants to ban the guns, and the other side is like, oh, it's just a mental health epidemic. And the mental health discourse is kind of interesting because, it reduces the issue of gun violence to just like a few bad actors, even though, statistically, there's a lot of, other factors that are involved with gun violence in the United States. And that's not to say I'm like favorable of like banning all guns, but like this whole it's a mental health issue or it's there's too many guns issue seems like a very kind of depoliticizing technocratic approach to a problem, which if you look at the cause base of it is related to like severe social and material conditions in American society that is creating violence. And as you're saying with the example of the university, people are like, oh, students are all sad because of the fees. Well, yeah, it's because the fees are a massive amount of stress for them. That's the problem. So you see this this mental health discourse is a way to neutralize problems. Is that how you would put it?
I suppose so. It transforms wicked issues, very, very difficult to solve issues, and issues that appear increasingly insoluble in the context of capitalism. It transforms these into something that appears more isolable, more soluble. So the gun issue in America is famously a wicked issue. This is a very, very difficult issue, and it's proven resistant to solutions. But when you transform it into a mental health problem, then it appears soluble. All you need to do is train these professionals to go into people's individual lives and give them these interventions and these treatments, and you'll solve this problem. And of course, that's not really how society works. Society is incredibly complex. And what winds up happening, so you just think, well, it's just this individual. And people will say, oh, well, it's a very complex issue in society, blah, blah, blah. But the end point is that it messes up the individual. It all resolves in some sort of disorganization within the mind of the individual. And so you can go in and kind of deliver these targeted interventions at the individual level and solve the problem. Oh, it's a mental health problem, so we will solve it in this way. And it's convincing. It's a very convincing story. But of course, as I was saying, society is incredibly complex, and there are very few monocausal problems, very few things that can be solved by an individualized intervention. And so what winds up happening is inevitably these sorts of things fail. And then there's just something else that comes up. Another fad will come up. Oh, well, it's not mental health. We need to be promoting X. It was self-esteem in the 80s and 90s, and then it was promoting mental health, and then it was like, oh, we need to promote well-being, and then mental health and mindfulness. There's always something. And it's never like, well, maybe we need to have like a grown-up conversation about deep structural inequalities in society, or like alienation or anomie, or a sense of normlessness and meaninglessness, or the lack of, I don't know, rites of passage for young people. Like all of these things that are sort of that get expressed in some of these horrific events, not just these, but all sorts of problems in society, they get deferred endlessly because it becomes about individual psychologized issues. And then we never really have this conversation about, young people being betwixt and between and never really growing up into anything, for instance, or, the most obvious wicked issue, which is persistent inequality in society, and the fact that violence tends to be concentrated there.
So, and yeah, we see like this kind of psychological pathologizing of these issues seems to me, and perhaps you've worked on this before, so you know more about it than me, but it seems to be a natural iteration of the older discourse of things like the deserving poor and the undeserving poor, these kind of cultural arguments related to poverty. I notice in my own field, when we talk about the history of nationalism and things like that, you see similar ideas coming back in a slightly different form. So, in the past you had like overt racist ideas. Now you have functionally the same ideas, just framed in cultural terms. And it seems like there's all these arguments going back, especially to the progressive era, in which you have the cultural pathologies of the poor, of different elements of society. And this is almost like seems like a kind of return to this kind of discourse, except in a more caring and medicalized discourse. Do you see a continuation?
Yeah, that's exactly the argument that I make in the book. So I see that there was no need to write the book. But yeah, that's exactly what I argue. That it's not like a cycle, because it's not that there's no development or anything like that. It's more that it's like a wave sort of pattern of these. I suppose they become fads now, but I suppose it wasn't necessarily faddish in the past. They were more paradigms, I guess. And so you had like mental hygiene, for instance, which was linked to eugenics, and the sort of mental hygiene movement, which was this idea that you could use the sort of rationalized tools of psychology and management to sort of fix and prevent problems before they start in populations. Obviously linked to the need to raise an army when necessary. But also this sort of social pathology approach to understanding social problems. If anybody has taken sort of A-level sociology, you probably know, you learned about organic analogies for society. So society is like a functioning organism. And, you know, Herbert Spencer talked about the brain is the government, and then you've got like the male is the circulatory system and all of that, and different kinds of theorists. Even Marx sometimes went into varying levels of detail, using the body as a metaphor for society. And of course, bad things then, social problems, bad people, so-called bad people, become a pathological outgrowth of an otherwise healthy social organism. And so there's this idea that if you can, my husband's outside the window making faces at me, and he's made me lose my train of thought. Are you going to edit this? Because it'd be great if you could edit that bit out. Anyway, yeah, no. Anyways, no. So these sorts of things became associated with the eugenics movement. Obviously, if you see society as a functioning organism and bad people and social problems as like a cancer, then the solution is you cut out the cancer. Right?
I mean, that's literally the discourse that the architects of the Armenian genocide used. The Armenians were a cancer because this biological metaphor was very prevalent in the early 20th century, and this became the discursive rationale at an elite level for the annihilation of the Ottoman Armenian community. And we see lots of different parallels with the sterilization of women from the working class and poor. Pascal has talked about on this channel about Black eugenics, about how there was a movement amongst Black Americans to raise their race up by pruning the unwanted elements. It's a disturbing. But what is the connection?
Well, let me just.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, yeah. Let me just finish the thought, and maybe it'll answer the question. But so mental hygiene was obviously associated with the eugenics movement and so on. But interestingly, after the Second World War, the word mental hygiene, for obvious reasons, falls out of fashion. And it's that exact moment when the language of mental health emerges. But social pathology always had a kind version and a stern version. And in the stern version, obviously it was eugenics. It was like, cut these people out, so on. But there was always a kind version, which thought that you could give people a moral education and kind of fix the pathology in society. But in both of these versions, the idea was that there's something wrong with you. Now, that biological metaphor still exists, and it exists in both of these forms. And you can see this a lot now, where like they were still sterilizing, allegedly, Indigenous women until 2017 in Canada. And I have always wanted to do a study of this, because now I could very, very well be wrong, because there was this awful, awful clip that came out of this, it's just absolutely horrible and fucking infuriating, of this Indigenous woman who was dying and begging for help. And the nurses were calling her a slut and stuff. So it could be that there's the mean version is still there. But I would be interested to know why they were, and the rationales that people had for why they were sterilizing Indigenous women, because I bet you it was for their own good. Well, don't you think you have too many children, more children than you can take care of? And don't you think it would be best? And shouldn't you get your life in order? And all these sorts of arguments that are very, very convincing when you actually hear them. And the end result is that you're sterilizing Indigenous women in 2017, right? So there's still this kind version that exists that is blind to broader social structures and inequality and poverty, and kind of thinks like, well, don't you think as a poor person, the right choice to make is that you shouldn't reproduce? Basically saying that poor people should be, no, they should be convinced, they should be denied the right, but we should convince them rationally that this is the right thing to do. So there's a kind version. And then there's the biological metaphor that gets reversed, which is a seemingly left-wing argument, which is the idea of the sick society. And you can trace this back to Eric Fromm, for instance. So social pathology, which was you have this healthy organism and you're a sick outgrowth, is flipped, and you get the pathological society, where society itself is sick and it infects the individual. And it has this sort of Rousseauian idea of like the individual is essentially good, but society comes in and infects you and makes you bad. But at the end of the day, in both cases, the answer is still a moral education. It's still going in at the individual level and fixing people. And that's it. That's the extent of our imagination today.
That's
actually, could you make the link between mental health and emotion here? Because the book is about emotion, and it might seem kind of obvious, the link between mental health and emotion. But if we think about it, like schizophrenia isn't an emotion. Depersonalization disorder isn't an emotion. So while it's almost kind of self-evident now that emotion and mental health or mental disorder or whatever are almost identical things, there is some kind of problem here. There is some kind of gap which needs to be explained, right?
Yeah, so you have to understand what mental health became. And it became this, and this is one of the arguments that I make in the book, that as things become fads, they expand to encompass everything. And then emotions no longer become so significant. So that's the argument that I make at the end of the book. I go through all these fads where emotions become highly significant to understanding social problems. But when you get to mental health, emotions are no longer significant. They become symptoms. Emotions become symptoms of mental ill health. So like university students are all taught all your negative feelings are mental health problems. So they'll say, I'm having problems with my mental health, not the first 3 months of my first year sucked. Like they don't say that. And like they'll say like I could say the first 3 months of my first year sucked. It was really hard. I was young and I was younger than everybody else. I couldn't go to the bars and all that. Or you could say I suffered greatly with my mental health for 3 months until I made some friends. And the studies actually will say this kind of thing. They're like, oh, first year students have struggled with their mental health for the first 3 months. And they'll say, and it takes 3 months to go back to normal levels. So they reframe that, and it takes 3 months so this is a bad thing that happens and it takes 3 months, instead of it being like, this is what happens sometimes when you adjust to a new situation. So those emotions don't become significant. They become significant only insofar as they indicate a problem. And then, as you say, it gets a little bit murky because there are real mental health problems that are mental illness, right? And mental illness becomes like a bad word that you don't say anymore. You say people struggling with their mental health, but then it becomes difficult to differentiate between these people who are feeling emotions and people who are ill, in a way right. That you would, and yes, there's a whole lot of debate about medical metaphors for even that, but I think it's just whatever. It is a social construction, but it's a very useful construction to make sense of things like that as a form of illness. I think it's useful. I think arguably, like enormous aberrations from some kind of norm. I mean, it makes sense to categorize that as a kind of illness. There's a lot of debate about whether or not it is an illness, blah, blah, blah. I don't think that's necessarily the most useful debate, at least pragmatically when we actually try to help people. But I think redefining a huge range of emotions as mental health, as indicative in some way of mental health, where mental health becomes a spectrum. And this is how policy documents now define it. Mental health is a spectrum that encompasses good mental health and bad mental health. So it's everything becomes encapsulated in mental health. I think that is not necessarily helpful, because then it becomes very difficult to differentiate, as I said, between these normal emotions, good emotions, righteous anger, for example, and a kind of illness, a kind of sickness. And it becomes normal to be ill. It's not possible nor useful, supposedly, to differentiate anymore.
It's almost
and then
like
this becomes crazy when people are actually trying to get help in practice. Like, it becomes mad because there's just this upward spiral of demand.
It's almost like a neutering of the political, in a certain sense, by making it, a mental health issue. Like you said, like, you might have a perfectly legitimate negative reaction or emotion to a particular situation that is, quote unquote, a negative emotion, because obviously that's like what a negative emotion is a social contract. And you're encouraged to seek medical assistance, which obviously it's hard to get. That's a different question. But you, rather than to seek a political solution to the overall situation that's affecting you. I mean, and there's to a certain degree, obviously there are people who have like serious mental illnesses, like physiological illnesses, that are not directly tied necessarily to their circumstances, right? But a lot of this, what you're saying here, Ashley, is a lot of so-called mental health issues are actually people adapting to external situations that can be quite difficult and that they can cope with. And by medicalizing them as well as a whole, we're kind of just we're taking the political aspect out of it and individualizing the issue. So the problem isn't high fees. The problem is that the high fees make you sad, right? And so like you need to go and get help for your sad feelings and not deal with the political issue in front of you.
Or you can like do certain sort of individualized things, like go to the money support office and do something for you as an individual that might actually help that situation, but not collectively. And that's one of the main sort of uses of a mental health discourse as well, is that it obviously it has a tendency to individualize or to encourage collectivity around mental health, but not around anything else. So students can come together and emote, that's fine. But you're not going to come together and demand reduced fees, because that's not going to happen. That's not a good use of your time. For that, we have certain services available. You can submit an application form over here. But there are a couple of things that you said. So one thing I want to mention too is like symptom surveys tend to be overused, and symptom surveys to like indicate the scale of a problem. And symptom surveys famously over-report, because they're just at any given time, you ever watch those? I recommend people watch those Adam Curtis documentaries, Century of the Self. And that's one of the points that he makes, is that one of the first thing that psychologists did to kind of, as part of expanding their influence and scope, was to send out these symptom surveys. And they were like, oh my God, the population is terribly mentally ill. But they didn't realize that like, just at any given time, there are really strong emotions that exist in the population. And it's terribly wrong and misguided to think of these things as illnesses. Now, I could use a really stupid and extreme example, but it's not that extreme, because this has actually happened. You could send out symptom surveys during slavery. And I bet you would find, oh my God, there's terrible mental illness in the population. Or you might find that actually people are not as unhappy as you might expect, which would then people would, well, oh gosh, should we end slavery then? Yes, because it's not about how you feel, for fuck's sakes. Like, the fact that people can be made happy, make the best of a bad situation, is a testament to the human spirit. It's not a reason to keep people in bad situations. We've totally lost that, because we now see emotions as the main purpose of society, the main purpose of life.
We need a therapist in every plantation.
Yeah. Plantation therapists. There you go.
Yeah, Because the anchor of meaning has been located inside the self now. We find it very difficult to imagine how you would find meaning beyond the self and something beyond you, something beyond the individual. So if a slave, and that's some of the arguments that slave owners actually made, that they treated their slaves well and that they were happy. Well, if that was true, let's say it was true, then is that a reason not to end slavery? Of course not. Sorry.
It was funny to read the surveys that you put in the book, where like the minimal condition to get on them is absolutely fucking ridiculous. And they were basically asking like, have you felt sad at any point in the last 3 months? And the only surprise was that the figure wasn't 100%, right? Because surely the actual figure is 100%. But I guess if they got that result, they wouldn't publish it because they would realize at that point how absurd they seemed.
I was amazed by that. 2% had the I want to know who that 2% were, because they didn't want to say.
I mean, I would say no on that, but just to be awkward,
Yeah, exactly. That's like a healthy kind of, resistance. I like that. But, I said that that's a silly example, but it's not as silly as you might think, because there was actually drapetomania was a diagnosis for slaves who tried to get away from their plantations, from their owners. Like that was, and I remember I had like a psychologist friend who posted on Facebook, one of those stupid, like, beach images with like text on top. And it was like, drapetomania, the desire to run away. Do they not teach you this shit in school? Like, how do you get a PhD and not realize that is a fucking like diagnosis for slaves, like that is used by people to show like the ridiculous culture-bound nature of some diagnoses?
All you need to know about a psychology degree.
No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm sure in fact, I think some of the very best critics come from having a psychology background. They're very balanced. But the other thing too is like what you were saying is, there are all these emotions that just exist in the population, and that people may not, if they're convinced or encouraged to believe that these are kind of mental health problems, they may not fight to change their circumstances. They might do still, but I think in a very kind of limited sense. Because as I said, the anchor for meaning is in the self. The purpose is in the self. But a movement has to find its meaning in the future. It has to develop and become something in the future. But the other thing is that sometimes negative emotions don't need a solution. It's okay to feel bad because the thing that happened to you is bad. And sometimes bad shit happens, and we would create a much worse world by trying to get rid of bad shit happening. I always think about The Giver, which I'm sure most people read as a teenager, and I did my first episode of Based AF, which is such a silly title when I say it out loud, but anyways, it can only be written down. Anyway, the first episode of that I did for Sublation Media, I talked about The Giver, and I had interviewed Nancy McDermott, who's an author, and she had said, Lois Lowry, the author of that book, why she wrote it was she was thinking like about things that seemed to her to be really good. Like, oh, wouldn't it be good if we, assign children to parents? Wouldn't it be good if, everything was done on an expert basis by like a council or something like that? And wouldn't it be good if we blah, blah, blah? And you create a nightmare dystopian scenario by trying to control everything and kind of legislate well-being into existence. No, you have to accept that you're going to feel bad. And sometimes you damn well should. And that's, maybe not damn well should, it's kind of a bad segue, but like the obvious example of this is the removal of the grief exception in depression diagnoses, right? Like it was just, doctors were like, well, no, we can't use these criteria to, way back when depression was first, when they first came up with this list, sent it out to doctors. Okay, now go and diagnose people. They said, well, no, if we follow these criteria, we're going to diagnose people with whose loved one has just died as being sick. That's not right. That's part of the human condition. And they go, oh, yes, of course. So you had this grief exception. Now the grief exception is gone. And it is ill. It is a kind of illness to be grieving. And I say this to my students, and I remember a student said to me, like, no, yeah, it's normal, and it's an illness. Like so it becomes normal. It becomes normal to be ill. Illness becomes the default state. And then that has other repercussions for our subjectivity, for what we believe people are capable of as human beings. You have to think, like, the idea of a rational, reasoning, self-reflective human subject who is well, just the ideal of it. I'm not saying this is representative of humans, but the ideal of it is the basis of our liberal democratic societies. And you can whine and complain about our liberal democratic societies, as I do all the time. But the answer is not to go back. The answer is always to go forward. And how can we go forward and truly realize freedom if we destroy the subject on which those freedoms are based? Right. So this becomes a much bigger issue. And that's one of the central themes of the book. It's kind of not only looking at each one of these and critiquing each one of these fads, but also asking, well, what does this say about how we understand what it means to be human now?
This is actually, something I wanted to kind of pick up on. The argument that you're making in the book also seems to be at variance with the kind of general left consensus on these issues in the neoliberal age. Specifically, there's this whole kind of pop psychology, left-wing pop psychology idea that, everything is about atomizing society. Everything is about turning people into these individual consumers. And this psychologizing is just a tendency of that atomization. But you're framing this in actually a very different and almost more totalitarian way of looking at it. Can you kind of outline how you differ from this kind of notion that everything is about, transforming people into individual consumers, and how this psychology is not really about creating the consumers, but it's more about when I was reading it, I was thinking of Foucault, the kind of disciplinary, society, the panopticon, except it's a nice panopticon that's going to check in on your mental health.
Yeah. I mean, there's not a lot. The trouble is when you kind of repeat some of these critiques, you lose the power. They become cliches. But there's not a lot in what I'm saying that isn't in Foucault. And I'm just not convinced that Foucault is as at odds with Marx as people say, particularly in his later work. But I don't know. I'm not a Foucault expert. Just sort of use Foucauldian scholars in my work. And obviously when I was much earlier in my career, I was very much more influenced by Foucault. But as time goes on and I kind of go back and read, for instance, lectures on the birth of biopolitics, I read that as a very Marxist text. And I find myself saying, yes, because this is exactly what I see when I look at these things. And I think when we just sort of cite Foucault perfunctorily without really engaging deeply with his work, we miss that some of these insights. So for instance, Foucault says it's not about creating Homo economicus. It's not about creating. Nobody wants this perfectly rational subject. Because if they have a perfectly rational subject, they're kind of, well, this is me now riffing off Foucault, but then they're kind of stuck for explaining social problems. So they need this destruction of the subject to explain why things go wrong. It goes back to what I was explaining before about social pathology. You're the problem. You're the problem. Look, we did all the math. We can see that capitalism should work in equilibrium, and nobody sane believes otherwise. And so if there's an issue, it's you. You're making the wrong choices. You're choosing wrong. And so people always talk about autonomy is the ideal. Autonomy is the ideal of our liberal societies. It's not. Nobody wants an autonomous subject. The very first claim that I see in every single one of the case studies that I look at in my book, I realized is they don't initially claim that there's a problem that needs solving. The first claim is your autonomy is a risk. You must understand that your reckless exercise of free will is a risk to yourself and others. The ideal is not autonomy, it is heteronomy. It's like if you go back to Kant, right? So Kant differentiates between autonomy and heteronomy. where autonomy is like obviously dare to know and all of that sort of thing that you think for yourself. Whereas heteronomy is where you realize that's crazy. You shouldn't be. Ask the experts. Ask the experts. That's what the good citizen does now. You have to have a will that is always guided by experts. And if there are no rules, that should scare you, and you should demand rules. And so, for instance, with the mental health discourse, it's like, so one of the very first claims, they were one of the things, like when I'm talking about student mental health, you might be assuming that there was like this big problem that everyone was responding to. But no, they were assuming that there was going to be a big problem, that students were more at risk than everyone else. And when they actually did the studies, you can't help but imagine that they were pretty disappointed with the results, that they found that like diagnosed mental illness was lower than the population. Even self-reports was slightly lower. That like they even use self-reports, which is known to inflate the rate of prevalence, and even that was lower than the general population. They were absolutely certain that students committed suicide far more frequently than other people, than other young people of the same age. It's actually about half the rate of the population of the same age.
I'm so shocked at the people who do like 10 hours of light intellectual labor a week are healthier mentally than the people who are like ground down in minimum wage work for so much more.
Or even
just having a purpose.
Oh yeah, they have a purpose, as opposed to like so many people I knew who killed themselves were like
neats.
You just had nothing. They were unemployed and just sat around like and felt kind of hopeless about the future. At least, kids in the university feel like, might be a lie, but feel like it's a pathway to continue on to do something else, just a necessary stepping stone. It can be stressful, but what isn't stressful? So
yeah, but when they found these statistics, they did these surveys, the National Union of Students did a bunch of surveys, and that was the first one, was I think it was 2013, where they asked for self-reported. So have you ever been diagnosed? Do you think you have a mental illness? Are you seeking diagnosis? And they merged all that together, and they got a 20% figure, that 20% of university students, and that was like, there was 10% who were diagnosed. And then the others were like seeking diagnosis, maybe, whatever. And they put that together as 20% and just assumed that they are. And even that was lower than the general population. And what they did, though, was they problematized self-reliance. That was the main claim. So the NUS put out this press release where they had all these like mental health charities that they had already teamed up with before they even did this survey. This is what happens with claims making. They think a problem exists, and then they do the survey. So then they've got the solution, and then they have to look for the problem. In social problems research, we call this conclusions in search of a ground. And sometimes you have like the different elements come together in backwards ways. Like you think like, oh, I've discovered this problem in the world. No, I have a solution. I have a hammer and I am looking for nails. That's how it usually works. Anyway, so they had already teamed up with all these sort of mental health charities and did this survey. And you can't help but imagine they were probably disappointed with that result. But they carried on and said what they would say anyway, like ignoring it. They were like, we know that students' mental health is more at risk than the general population. But it wasn't. And they kept saying, like, we know this, because they assumed that any negative thing, which is that it is hard sometimes to go to university, is challenging, it's difficult, there are lots of deadlines.
Many people are leaving their mom's house for the first time, right? It's like the first time.
Exactly. Transitions are hugely problematized. Yeah. And so they assumed that it was a big problem. And then but the thing that they problematized was self-reliance, that most of the young people at that time in 2013 preferred to rely on themselves and their informal networks when they had a problem. And that was the thing that they drew up for scrutiny. That was dangerous and risky. And so it was your responsibility. This is heteronomy. You should not be autonomous because they were autonomous. The majority of students were autonomous, and that was the problem that they pointed out.
Don't talk to your friend about being sad.
That doesn't make any jobs.
Yeah.
Well, that's actually what I wanted to get to. Let's get to the crude materialist phase of everything. So this discourse, to what extent, I mean, we see this, for example, with a lot of diversity, equity, and inclusion. There is an entire apparatus of businesses and NGOs that have a vested material interest in perpetuating this discourse. And I think that's pretty, it's pretty well apparent to people. Now, in terms of this mental health discourse, who is propelling this discourse, and what role do we see, like, organizations such as the charities that aligned with the NUS, the National Union of Students, like actively trying to create a market for their particular services? What factions are most susceptible to wanting to implement this kind of discourse, either for like ideological reasons because that's how they see the world, or for just straight up a mix of like, this is doing good, but I'm also going to get paid?
Yeah. I mean, there's that going on. And there's a lot, again, with any complex social phenomenon, there is multi-causal. So part of what happened was you had the expanding, there's a general tendency for psychological categories to expand. Sociologists have been calling it diagnostic bracket creep since the 70s, but psychologists who are always late to catch on, but much better at naming things, have called it concept creep, which is much better, I think, but which refers to the sort of generalized, not just diagnostic categories, but general tendency for concepts, and particularly psychological concepts of harm and so on, to become fuzzier, their definitions to expand more and more and more. And obviously, any kind of profession has an interest in expanding its domain, expanding what it can be said to be responsible for, what it can do. And that's just naked self-interest to a certain extent. It's people who are passionate about what they do, obviously. But so part of that, this is part of the story. So these counseling groups were expanding, and they were expanding their influence into a huge range of institutions. And you can take this all the way back to the beginning of the 20th century, when you had like the first mental hygiene clinics in American universities, put forward by eugenicists, by the way. That's sort of the origins of it as well. And then gradually you had this expansion of these claims makers, or these advocates for the expansion of services, into a huge range of institutions, not just universities, schools, for instance. And they had been massively successful in embedding mental health, well-being, mindfulness, etc., in schools. And universities were kind of a natural follow-on from that. And universities were receptive for a variety of reasons. One was they had lost their sense of meaning and purpose. Like they were getting a lot of flack for being elitist institutions. They were being tasked with solving all kinds of problems like that they couldn't solve. You get 50% of young people or more to go to university, and that's going to drive the economy and drive economic growth. It's going to end inequality, all of these sorts of things. So universities were receptive in that sense. Students were receptive because they had just gone through therapeutic education their whole lives. You had the success in one institution led to the success in another institution. But so the groups themselves were expanding into all these new institutions. And once you are successful in one, then it's easier to expand into another. And a good example of this is Anthony Selden, who was headmaster of the prestigious Wellington College in England. And he took over as a VC of, I think it was Buckingham, I can't remember. But he announced that would be the first well-being university, the first happiness university, So it's very clear, ideas don't just emerge out of the ether, people have them and they seek to expand them and to move them into new institutions. And this is what Selden very obviously did. He's like very influential advocate of like well-being and mental health education and just expanding this discourse to encompass everything. And he goes to university and expands the discourse there. But part of what the counseling professions were doing was reinterpreting some legislation, at least in the story that I tell is in the UK, but there's similar issues going on in the United States. What they did was they reinterpreted some legislation on disability to include mental health. And they argued that universities risked failing in their duty of care. So there was legislation that came through that universities had to accommodate students with disabilities. And they said, well, this includes mental health problems. And you'll be failing in your duty of care if you fail to do this. And you'll be at risk of litigation.
Oh, geez.
And so what they managed to do was they drew on this growing idea of, well, this growing, I don't know what to call it, this growing kind of institutional trend or institutional changes within capitalism that John Braithwaite calls the regulatory state or regulatory capitalism, where institutions, organizations become more and more aware of risk. So this explains why every time you have a problem, your dog dies or something, they all freak out and they're like, go see a professional. It's partially because those professionals need jobs. And it's partially because the university wants to identify you as a risk. Because the behavior of students is a potential risk to the institution. And the way that it works is the institutions are communities of fate. So it's not just you're not just a risk to one university. When something bad happens in a university, it's a risk to the whole sector. It reflects badly on universities in general. So they all become receptive to these claims from these claims-making organizations, these advocacy groups that big up these risks about student suicide and so on. So they're like, if you fail here, if you don't expand services, then you're going to have student suicides. And the universities were very receptive to those claims. So they were receptive for a wide range of reasons, because they're communities of fate and they're more receptive to claims about risk, and they're interested in risk reduction, and student behavior is a risk to the institution. Young people are like, they're crazy, right? The consumers are a risk to the institution, and they need to, what mental health discourse does is it offers the ability to transform those risks into assets. So you give them, like, you give people who had mental health problems, mental health first aid training, and then they minister to others. So now they become an asset to the institution. They become activists around mental health. And then that goes on their CV. That makes them more employable. They become assets. And the other thing was that they had lost their meaning and purpose, as I was saying before. They'd come under criticism about being elitist institutions. And they even said, like, when this whole mental health discourse was reaching its apex, they were like, universities are not about knowledge anymore. Like, they even said that. They came out and said they're not about knowledge anymore. So there's this kind of like floundering about searching for a purpose. So yeah, part of it was about risk reduction. And then, of course, what wound up happening was, as these organizations kept saying, seek professional help no matter what, and the university was like, yeah, identify yourself. The two major claims that I kept seeing over and over and over in my research was disclose and seek professional help. If you have a mental health problem, disclose it, no matter how insignificant you think it is. Disclose it to the institution because we can help you. And then students come to university and they're like, well, I can't seem to get any help. And I was like, yeah, because that's not the point. The point of it is to identify yourself so that your risk can be minimized. And then seek professional help. And then it's funny because we did these, this is for a British Academy funded project. So we did these interviews with professionals, and they were like, oh, well, the students are coming to us like when their dog dies. And why are you coming to us for such small problems? And I'm like, because you told them to. You told them to. And then when they come with the big problems, they're like, ooh, we don't know how to deal with this. And they try to push everything downstream, which is a whole other thing. I've got a paper coming out. It's a whole other side of this.
Downstream.
So they keep pushing risk because the students, I don't know. Sorry, I've been talking for too long, and it's going to take me a while to explain the pushing downstream thing. But so what they do is they identify students and they tell them, oh, come to us, seek help. But the university is also conscious of the risk of an upward spiral in demand, which is exactly what's happened. So they encourage students to come for everything. And then there's just, it's impossible to keep up with that kind of demand. But also, they now put the risk of student suicide and so on and student behavior onto counseling services. So what happens if something goes wrong? Who's at fault? Who holds the risk? Counseling services. Right? And so you get this weird situation where counseling services, or what's been renamed well-being services, actually part of this, which pushes risk downstream. They both are like annoyed when they get people who don't have big problems and scared when they do.
Right. So it's like they're almost completely useless because they don't want to deal with like people's dog dying, because even they know it's normal. You're going to be sad. Your dog died. And then when it's a big problem, like I'm feeling bad because I got raped at a nightclub, then it's like, whoa, that's beyond my pay grade. I can't deal with that. And you need to go to the police or what have you.
It's not necessarily that they're useless. It's just that these are things that are kind of above their pay grade, or that they can wind up holding the risk. They may be able to help, but it can be risky to them if something goes wrong. So what happens is what they want joined up services with the NHS. So when they identify those problems, they can shoot them onto the NHS. Now the NHS goes, oh, the student mental health crisis is costing the NHS all this money, because they've convinced everybody they have to go seek help. So they're all getting funneled to the NHS. And the NHS doesn't want to deal with them either. The NHS says, no, this is the university's responsibility. And the university says, no, this is the NHS's responsibility. And then if you actually have like schizophrenia, good luck. It's very, very difficult, because you're sort of sorting through all of this that's happening. So it gets very, very complex. But the end sort of goal, or the end sort of argument is that it's primarily about risk and risk management. And so what they try to do is diffuse that risk. So they pushed it onto counseling services, but then to diffuse the risk more, they call them well-being services. And their disclaimers all over their web pages: this is not a health service. If you have a problem, go to the NHS. So they call it well-being. And then they've repositioned their purpose as promoting mental health and well-being. And then you embed it in the curriculum, and then you train students in it, you train staff in it, and you spread the risk all across the institution. But of course, nobody wants the risk anyway. So even when you spread it out across the institution, everyone's like, you try to put it on academics. Academics are like, I don't want this risk. And, it right. becomes quite difficult. And at the end of the day, like, this mess was created by the fact that like autonomy was so problematized in the first place. And this is a general kind of issue that we have in our society, that we do not trust people to exercise their autonomy. Autonomy is seen as a risk. And that's the issue here, that the autonomy is seen as a risk to the institution. It needs to be contained.
And it seems also that, as you've mentioned, that, informal networks of social support are like frowned upon, and we have to go to this kind of rational hierarchy of experts. So, even you hear like nowadays people talking about, emotional labor, like, oh, you're putting me in so much emotional labor. It's like, well, that's what a friendship is, you idiots. You know what I mean? Like everything is turned into like a transactional relationship. So why are you having a transactional relationship with your informal support network rather than going to the appropriate authorities with your sad feelings? Why are you burdening people with your issues? So it seems also that there is a kind of insidious discourse which seeks to smash people's self-created social networks of support and replace them with a kind of hierarchical, more controllable form of support.
Which then creates its own risks, right? Because then if you, like, everybody has a problem. Like, That's what life is about. We're all just trying to figure this out, and we come to each other. We used to go to priests. We used to go to each other. Now, if you kind of tell everybody, no matter how small the problem is, like this claim is everywhere. No matter how small the problem, you might think it's a problem, but it can snowball. It can spiral out of control and become much better. Even like normal things, like a dog dying, are said to spiral out of control without treatment. And so, of course, the risk there is that demand goes up and up and up and up, and it's impossible to keep up with it. So what they'll try to do then is they try to digitize it.
Okay.
Because what happened was these advocacy groups became victims of their own success. You know, it's expensive to hire a whole bunch of psychologists and psychiatrists and so on. So the institutions start to push back, and they start doing and not just the university, but it's everywhere. They start becoming receptive to people who kind of fill in that gap. Oh, I'll save you costs. I'll save you costs. I'll sell you these stickers that everyone can wear, so we can all wear emotions on our sleeves. My sister sent me this. She was like, "Look what they handed me today," and she showed me a picture of her hand, and it was like a bunch of sticker emojis: happy, sad, frustrated. You know? And you're supposed to put these on yourself while you walk around. You know, all this crap. Like well-being Wednesdays, meditation sessions. When I was doing my PhD, I always remember there was one that was like laughter facilitation consultants who will come into your workplace for some fee, and everyone's standing around going, ha, 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 ha.
That's crazy.
And then you've got apps, and there's just this huge industry that has exploded that universities then try to like start putting money into, and surveillance as well.
Have they managed to turn Chat GPT into a counselor yet? Because I think
So there was not Chat GPT, but apparently Chat GPT is just being like informally used in that way, which speaks to our incredible alienation and atomization. But even before this, there was a student who developed something called Coco, I think, a long time ago, which used like a form of AI to auto-generate responses to people on an app. So you could go on to this and be like, I don't know, ask a question, and it would give you some sort of like auto-generated AI kind of response to it. What's interesting is that guy sold his software to Airbnb because it was a very good online surveillance data gathering tool. So like there is overlap between a lot of these apps and the sort of generalized surveillance. And that's the sort of next step in a lot of this, is this dehumanization of the surveillance. Because as I said, it's about risk, identifying the risks and surveilling the risks. So there's all in the universities, there's software that's being developed that will identify well-being markers.
And you'll be able to boot problem makers out of the university, like with
exactly.
You're going to be able to.
That's part of the point. That's part of the point. And it's not just in universities. Like they'll tell young mothers, oh, disclose, you know, the stiff upper lip is so passe. You know, if you've got a problem, you need to make sure. And part of it, and then, you know, I remember I was on, like, when I had my kids, I was on Baby Center, you know, like the birth forums, like the due date of your baby, you're in the same month with all these people. And so you like, I don't know if it's the same month. Yeah, around the same due date. So you all chat with each other. And there were loads of stories of women who thought that they were being like good citizens by disclosing their mental health problems, their negative feelings about parenthood. It's like pretty normal, especially now when you parent totally alone. And this was used against them to subject them to further surveillance and so on. Because that's the point. It's not to like offer you care. Yeah, okay, you might get that. That's good, particularly for some people who are struggling. But that's like almost an offshoot. The point is to recognize risk. So as I was saying, like the next sort of step in all of this is its digitization and more digital forms of surveillance. So there's an example I gave you in the university, but there are, I remember I was on a panel once where they were like, there's a guy who was like so excited about new app technology that can diagnose you with mental illness from your eye movements on your phone, like with the camera,
it's terrifying.
camera on your phone. Yeah.
And it seems like a lot of quackery. A lot of it seems like quackery. Like,
Oh, of course. Jesus Christ, of course. Like, it's quackery. It's like quackery on top of quackery on top of quackery. Like, it's fucking ducks the whole way down.
It's like you see this in like disciplines like criminology, where they have all this kind of pseudo-psychological stuff to try and identify who. It's all just like one step away from skull measuring, if you ask me. It's like one step removed from skull measuring. It's like the criminal skull.
Well, yeah, there are papers, academic papers, that argue this is new age phrenology. That people are looking for, like, people used to look for the place on the skull that explained this. Now they're looking in the brain.
Yeah, I think
they just managed to go one level deeper.
This is like this. This is the, I think this is the thing of our age, though. You know, we're seeing a lot of old concepts being, like you said, it's not a cycle, which I think it's fair enough. It's not just, they're not just bringing back old things, but things with a similar things that rhyme with things in the past in a new form are coming back. Whether that's like, you know, old-fashioned blood and soil nationalism, except this time it's good, right? Or you know, what have you. So many old ideas are getting recycled, and just a new veneer of kind of pseudoscientific discourse is being put on top of it, like technobabble. It's like, this is not skull measuring. This is brain weighing, which is a very different. You know.
Well, this is really good. I'm glad that you said that. I did want to say, though, that I've just contributed an article to a special issue in sociological research online. And one of the papers is about how, like, if you think about the idea of the panopticon, like Bentham's panopticon, even the watchers are watched, right? There's nobody outside of it. There's nobody outside of it who's not watched. And this is kind of what digital technology does. Like, there's a paper in this special issue that I thought was really interesting about new digitized forms of psychological surveillance. And it's like, they don't trust self-reports. They need to get deeper than that. It reminds me of the last scene of The Circle by Dave Eggers. Maybe you've read that book, where the woman's, just spoiler alert, but if anybody wants to read that book, the last scene, the woman is looking at a screen where brainwaves are being shown. And she's like, all that information, not yet coded. What a waste. You know, that's like the final frontier. But anyways, they don't trust people. So they like give people mobile phones to like track their emotions all day. And they'll like have this self-report app. And that's not enough. They want to get into the brain, to read it directly, because they don't trust people left to their own devices, you know, literally and figuratively.
It's funny you mention this, because my father is a neurophysiologist, and he like has very little time for psychology as a discipline or psychiatry.
That's interesting,
because my father, like, he can identify. He looks at brainwaves. Like, that's his like super skill, and he can look at a brainwave and tell, like, you've got epilepsy, you've got carpal tunnel, you know, like he can do that. But like a lot of the other stuff, he says, it's all just mumbo jumbo. It's just mumbo jumbo. They just do a mumbo jumbo, as my father says. My father is not very politically correct.
I was going to say, can he identify Arabs?
He can. He definitely can't identify trans women, because a trans woman once complained that my father was rude to her. And my father, his defense was, and we told him, don't use this. I didn't know she was a trans. I just thought she was an ugly woman. And I was like, you can't say that.
Oh God. But it's interesting, because actually that is in a lot of the critical studies. That's one of the things that they find, is that it's often people who are, it's secondary claims makers who run with this stuff, not the primary claims makers. So people will run with neuroscience who are not themselves neuroscientists. And the neuroscientists are like, everybody, let's just take this, let's just dial this back. So it's, you know, it's not necessarily the people who are actually doing the research that run with these things. It's the people who try to apply that research to social problems, what we call scientism. But you had brought up something very interesting. You said it's interesting that it's not cycles, but it's something that we seem to be rehashing these things over and over and over again. And that's the sort of one of the central kind of themes of the book that I'm trying to get at. because how I got this idea to write the book in the first place was I noticed when I finished my PhD, I did my PhD on happiness, and then I wrote a book about it, and I published that book in 2015. And I remember, because when I was doing my PhD, I did a lot of conferences, and I remember that it was hard. It was tough work. I got grilled. I got really grilled, which is good. It's good for you. But it was very hard for me to convince people. And they were like, no, but there's a science as hard as nails that proves that this is true and this stuff works. And if we could just teach happiness to school children, then we're going to blah, 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 all these sorts of things. And and it was, by the time my book came out, when I would go on podcasts or on TV or whatever, I got a lot of nodding heads. And I found that really interesting because they had moved on. And they were on about mindfulness. No, but a science as hard as nails proves this stuff works, that this is a good explanation for X, Y, Z, that this is da. And they were, they'd moved on to the next big thing. And then I noticed, like, I had already started noticing as I was writing that book, and I talk about it in the last chapters, that the language of happiness was giving way to well-being.
Right.
And then the language of well-being began to give way to mental health. And then I noticed I had on my bookshelf a 1998 book by John P. Hewitt called The Myth of Self-Esteem, critical book of the self-esteem movement in America. And the subtitle of that book was Solving Problems and Finding Happiness in America. And the first claims makers for happiness as a social problem were critics of self-esteem, but they had been advocates of self-esteem only 10 years earlier. That's like Martin Seligman. Yeah, sorry.
That's a fascinating dynamic, because it's that changing the quote unquote fad paradigm, but they're maintaining like the desire to have a discrete solution to a particular problem. Like there's a magic bullet, and we just have to find that correct magic bullet. And you see this with all areas of policy reform. To return to the gun issue, right? The issue of guns is not, God forbid, the complete social and economic degeneration of large parts of the United States. It's whether we have red flag laws to find crazy people with guns, or whether we allow people to have rocket launchers or not, right? Which are ultimately kind of just, they're like, they may work marginally in certain cases. Like maybe if people didn't have so many guns, they would be less shooting. Maybe if people had some mental health support, if they were gonna do a shooting or there was a red flag, maybe that would help. But does that really deal with the actual concrete underlying social, economic, and cultural conditions that are giving rise to this level of violence? Like when I was in Iraq, right? Iraqi society obviously has like many problems, but like people have all these like familial like networks that they can rely on, right? Everybody has a freaking gun, and they're not going and shooting each other, right? I mean, they're shooting each other within special contexts.
Let's shoot each other way.
Very specific circumstances.
Context, but like you don't.
To be fair, I don't know how much better that is.
But you don't have like the randomness of this kind of alienated violence. So when people talk about those issues, it's always to find like some kind of technical. You see it with the police issue. First, it was like we need to train racial sensitivity, defund the police, abolish the police. None of it gets to the core, which is like the police like providing, like the police have to exist in a class society, whether you fucking like it or not, until you get rid of.
Okay, but Gene, people with philosophy degrees and psychology degrees and sociology degrees also have to exist in a capitalist society, whether you like it or not. And they need their special programs purchased for just £3,000 a pop.
Exactly. Well,
that's part of what's going on here. Absolutely. That's part of the story, but there's a whole dynamic. But what I was going to say is that underneath all of this, so what it occurred to me is that every time something comes up, we treat this one thing in isolation, right? Like it's got nothing to do with all the other things. So it was like, oh, well, yeah, that happiness thing. No one believes that anymore. Oh, that self-esteem fad. Oh, and by the way, you said, this treatment might help or whatever. Thing is, like, it massively I don't know why people estimate the efficacy of mental health support. Like it's this magic bullet. If you look, first of all, there's a huge problem generally in psychology at the moment with replication, the so-called replication crisis, not just in psychology, but across the social sciences generally. Most of the studies are done by people who are heavily invested in the outcomes. I did this intervention, and oh, surprise, surprise, I found that the intervention was useful. Amazing. So there's a critical lack of like good quality research. And when there's good quality research, they often find that a lot of interventions are about as effective as time. Like, yes, it feels good to go and speak to somebody. I'm not saying that that is important. That is we need that as part of our alienated society as well. We used to talk to priests. We don't have that anymore. This is the New Age confessional. But the degree to which it actually like helps people solve a problem, overcome something, it doesn't necessarily. It feels nice for a little bit, but time heals all wounds too.
Right. And
I'm not saying don't do it. Do it is fine, but don't imagine that it's going to solve social problems.
And I mean, when I was doing my PhD, I had several moments of like crisis because it's a stressful process because you're like busy working and then you're like, why am I doing this? This is pointless. And will I ever get a job after it? And I just remember my dad's advice to me was like,
oh my God, that's so funny. Sorry, go ahead.
Son, you are sad. And at the end of the day, no one can do anything about it. You have to make yourself stop being sad. And I was like, okay. And, because, again, sometimes talking over a problem can be helpful, but sometimes you're just like rehashing things and, like it's a very individual input. There might be a moment where it's useful for you to get something off your chest, but then there might be a moment where it's like kind of like dwelling on something you don't need to do. It's like how, people are always women who have suffered rape or sexual assault. It's like that somehow they're broken, like that you can't recover from. It's like, no, like, yes, it may affect people differently, but some people it can just like, it happened, I'm fine and I can deal with it. It's often like people trying to rehash that and say, you got to talk about it. That like becomes difficult. So I think, I think there is, I'm not an expert on psychology, but it seems like it'll be very hard to make a kind of general rule of things because of like just the different psychologies of people, the different like just the different life places that people are in, right?
Add in the complicating factor of cross cultures. Like people have totally different, this is a huge area of research and discussion and so on, that people just have totally different ways of dealing with things. Like in our culture, we think that if you don't talk about something bad that happened, then you are repressing it. And it's like, oh, you're putting it inside of a bottle and it's going to burst out one day. But a lot of cultures, after a disaster happens, after a horrible thing, people die, that sort of thing, they have like rituals that they do. And then they don't think about it anymore.
That's so true.
And then it becomes like an issue because psychologists come and they're like, no, you have to talk about it one-to-one with this stranger. And they find it very weird. And they're like, I remember someone sent me this paper. I've never been able to find it again. It was like this person, I don't remember, somewhere in Africa. They were like, well, where is the drumming? Where is the dancing? Like, this is an anathema to their idea of how you deal with grief. Anyway, sorry, go ahead.
No, I just remember when I went to see my family in Iraq, one of our like aunties passed away. She was very old, and I went to the funeral, and all the women there were like wailing and crying and doing like screaming and things like that. Next day, everybody's chill, having dinner. They did they had their way of dealing with it. They were sad, but they had their public ritual of expressing their like sadness, and then like, okay, we got to get back. We got kids, we got food to cook, we got a life to live, and things like that. And people, they didn't like dwell on it in the same way, but they didn't repress it either. They had like this big demonstration in public of their sadness, and moved on with it. So I think there's just like it's almost like becomes like self-indulgent to talk about your problems all the time. Not that you shouldn't talk about your problems, but like it's also becomes like, it's like, I don't want to talk about this all the time.
Yeah, that's the thing, is that like our culture deals with things in this particular way, and many people find that useful. But the point is that it's not like a human thing that is a necessity. And that is often how it is portrayed, that this is just the normal human thing. And this becomes a problem when you don't want to deal with that. It becomes an imperative. So if you don't go through, like, this is something in like people have noticed in grief studies, where it's become this idea that you're supposed to go through stages of grief. And if you don't go through that, then there's like something wrong. But like that was that's supposed to be like an observation. And then it becomes something that's like a tendency becomes then prescriptive. Like you're supposed to go through these sorts of things. That's not necessarily the case. In fact, studies have shown that people who lose children years and years later, they never get over it, ever. And that's okay. It's not you have to get over it and like leave it behind and have closure. What? No, that wound just never closes for some people. But what I was going to say too about you said you talked to your dad during your PhD. I laughed because that's exactly what I did. I had this like crisis. And I always say, I've seen this with so many PhD students. There's like this, maybe this can segue into the point that I didn't finish earlier, but there's like this gap between like where they are and where they need to be. And there's always this moment where they need to be seems a lot closer than they could possibly, like, it's like coming at them like a freight train. And they're like, uh-oh, if I don't get on that train, it's just going to run me over. And it's this moment of like deep despair where you're like, oh shit, like, I don't think I can do this. Because it's a huge leap. Because there's always inevitably in like between second and third year, or if you're in your write-up year, between your third and your write-up year, where you're like, oh my God, so much needs to be done. I don't think I can do it. And I don't know what the hell I'm doing. And you fall into this black pit. I've seen this like so many times. Anyway, so I was in that pit of despair. And I called my dad and I was like, I can't do it. Like, I cannot do this. Like, and I was trying to convince him, I cannot do this. And he started laughing. And I was like, Dad, like I am like deeply despairing here. And he was like, oh no, like I think I used to know this guy who was doing a PhD and he said the exact same thing you're saying right now. He's like, I'm pretty sure like everybody who does a PhD feels that way. And I was like, oh.
Has Stefan got to that point yet? No.
Not yet.
I've never had a deep despairing crisis in my life. I don't think it'll ever happen, but we'll see.
Oh, that's good. That's that's very healthy, actually. But no, it's funny because like my dad laughing at me was so good because then I didn't take seriously this awful feeling that I had. And I was just like, oh yeah, because like the amount that I have to do is so daunting. And this guy randomly did it. So like, I guess that's just what you go through and then you just do it. And I did. And I managed to do it amazingly. Anyways, but it was funny because like that's an informal network. That's not taking, it's like so many broken things there, so many rules of our like therapeutic culture broken. I relied on an informal network. I should have got professional help. And I didn't take my emotions seriously. I used my powers of reflection and the experiences of other humans. And I thought, this is not out of the ordinary.
I'm obviously just refusing to see my problems. And so feeling fine is in fact the worst feeling of all.
There you go.
Yeah, I do think that actually to be successful doing a PhD or as an academic, you have to have like deep and impossible to escape self-doubt and fear of failure. So you doubt your ability.
That's why I don't want to be an academic.
So you doubt your ability and you're like, oh, fuck, I can't do this. But if I don't do it, I'm going to fail. And so you just kind of endlessly work between those two things.
The dialectic of failure. There you go.
Yeah.
It's kind of kind of like parenthood, right?
Yeah, God. Yeah. It is. There's so many parallels. I've thought about this many times. Although I will say I much preferred childbirth to my Viva.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, definitely. It was a very similar experience.
Mine was very chill. I went to the office.
I'm sure childbirth was really easy for you.
No, I didn't have the childbirth. Childbirth was very difficult for me because I had to stay up late and I couldn't go to sleep and I had to wait and sit there. And
did you bring your Nintendo Switch?
I did not have my Nintendo Switch and my phone ran out of battery, so I just had to sit there waiting for the baby to come out. Come on, baby.
My husband was on his phone. He was like, flick, flick. That's what he was doing. And I'm like, I look back and I'm like, it was wonderful. It was the most wonderful experience ever. And he's like, you were screaming. You were screaming. You couldn't possibly do it. Like to knock you out.
Ashley was there going, what the fuck did you do to me? Ah! Ah!
No, I was screaming. I couldn't do it. So it's very similar to a PhD in that way.
I can't do it. I can't do it. Just take the bastard out. Yeah.
No, never. I wouldn't say that about my little baby.
No, my first one was a giant baby. He came out as nearly 10 pounds. Poor bang. And with a full head of hair.
Oh, she must have had terrible heartburn.
Yeah, full head of hair. A little mustache and everything. Very proud of very proud of him.
I posted in chat the diagram of all male emotions.
Oh yeah, the diagram of all male.
Anger and horny. Am I right?
Is horny in there?
None of these are conventional emotions.
Mum would be sad. It's so over. It is what it is. We vibing. We are so fucking back. Fuck it all, ball. We ball. Okay, there you go.
I don't think my husband has all of those. I think he just has he does. Honestly, he's so I don't know. He grew up in like a little village, just like doing traditional things and like playing soccer and doing his thing. And
chasing the goats in the village.
Basically,
preparing to defend against the Turks in case they come.
That too, yes. I've had to convince him that he cannot defend against the Turks if they come. Sorry,
defend against the Turks.
No, he can't.
I think it is what it is one of the most powerful mantras you can possibly deploy.
That's it. That's the one. That's the only emotion I think he has, pretty sure.
That's a classic peasant emotional state, really. It is what it is. You know?
Yeah. I've known this man for 20 years and I've never seen him cry. Not once.
You don't cry in the village, right? You know, that's an urban thing. Like my dad told me a story in the village. There was like a peasant family and they had a lot of kids and they, were naming them like very random names. And one of them was called Sang, which means stone. And then like the poor little stone died as a baby, and like the my dad, I think, or somebody like close to him said, "Oh, where's Sang?" Because woman's like, he got washed away in the river, but we got.
That's
fatalism. That's peasant fatalism.
Yeah, there's a very good book by Nancy Shepherd Hughes called "Death Without Weeping." Very famous book about this is what happens. Like in our culture, children are objects of deep emotional attachment, and they are precious, and they serve no purpose at all besides like self-fulfillment and self-realization. But in most cultures, they are like useful objects, and you have a lot of them because they often die. Mm-hmm. And when children die a lot, you can't get attached to them, and you don't get attached to them. And in some cultures, you don't even give a child a name until I've read recently up till 10 years old. I hadn't known that. I knew that there were cultures that keep their children, babies at the back of a tent for the first year and don't talk to them, and only name them and talk to them when they're a year old. And they grow up to be like contributing members of society. Some get PhDs as well.
Well, my grandpa, I'm sure he didn't get attached to his children. He must have he had at least 30 children. So.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
I thought my family was bad. I've got 37 first cousins.
I don't know how many first cousins I have. Well, because my grandpa had 3 wives, so
Right, I figured that was.
He was keeping
one particular woman was extremely prolific. I figured
exactly.
Multiple wives.
He was busy.
He was rotating.
He was rotating. My dad, I think my granddad was like 73 when my dad was born. So he was.
Oh wow! So he was one of the last ones.
He wasn't the last one though. he was still keeping that powerful, impregnating weapon, as it were. Well, that's the life of a feudal lord,
Yeah, that's very much like reminds me of like indigenous people mixed with, I don't know, well, I'm indigenous mixed with Irish, so my culture is a mixture of both, but like just tons and tons
It's
of
a lot of kids either way.
A lot of kids,
random ass names,
and a lot of kids, and a lot of propensity for the fire water, huh?
Oh yeah, there's these kinds of issues in our family as well. But like I got Octavius, Wilma, Fox. These are
those are good names. Like all mine are like Ahmed, Abdullah, Aziz, Abdul Wahab, Abdul Aziz. Blah blah blah. Forever, Muhammad 1, Muhammad 2, Muhammad 3.
It's funny,
Muhammad
like
4.
in Kurdistan, even in revolutionary culture, you can't have a lot of revolutionary names because everyone's named after martyrs. And the first martyrs were, of course, just had normal names because they were normal people before the revolutionary movement.
You got a lot of Dennis after Dennis Geshmish, but that's it. Well, we have been going on for 1 hour and a half. I'm sure Ashley has many things to do for social reproduction in the house, academic work, all that kind of stuff. Maybe we should reconvene another time and talk about parenting.
That's another area of my research as well, so I could definitely go off on that. But one thing that I wanted to say too was that we didn't get to, that perhaps we could go into, is I started answering and then I got sidetracked because I read all these notes about things that I want to say as you're talking.
Go for it.
The last few of them, you can't stop me.
But no, it's just that maybe we could talk about another time. But you had said it seems like all these things are being rehashed again and again. Mm-hmm. And that is the explanation. That's the thing that I try to explain in my book. And the explanation that I use, that like the reason why these things, you criticize one thing, another one pops up, because while that discourse failed, the things that underlie it are still there. And that's what we're speaking to. And the question is, what is that? And obviously there are lots of things, but I think at the heart, when we're talking like discursively, like, what are we talking about again and again and again? Why do we keep telling these same stories about human beings and their role in social problems? And they contain similarities across a huge number of discourses. And I think it's because we have never been able to bridge the past and the future, or the present and the future. We've never been able to get to the land of the promised land, the equality, freedom, brotherhood that we were promised in the French Revolution. We've never been able to realize that in real life. We know that equality is a lie because we have the reality of inequality. You preach fraternity and we have war, liberty, and all we have is unfreedom, or various forms of unfreedom. So we know that our society lies and doesn't live up to its promises. We have persistent inequalities, persistent social problems, wicked issues that resist explanation. And the answer, and that demands an explanation. And going back to the French Revolution, you had a few people that said, well, the reason is because we have structures in our society that are not conducive to real equality. We have a society that is based on inequality, and that is obviously going to produce inequality all over the place. This is long before Marx, right? Obviously, Marx said the same thing. But long before Marx, you had people who said that. And then you had people, so I'm thinking of the example that I give in the book is the Marquis de Condorcet and Thomas Malthus as the person who says, no, it's not in society, it's in you, humanity. It is the reason why we have all of these problems in society is because there's something in us that is rotten, and that produces a rotten society, and will always be that way. And there's no point in trying to change things because the rot is within. Look no further than yourself. And he tells the whole essay on human population is all about, it's just about sex and food, and these things are just going to cancel themselves out, cancel each other out, and there's no point in trying to make things better. It's always going to be this way. And that's the tension that we have. We have kind versions of Malthus, and we have mean versions of Malthus. We don't have a whole lot of Condorcets.
It's conservatism. I mean, it's the fundamental.
Yes.
That's why people often criticize, I guess, Ashley and certain other people on the left for being like against certain left orthodoxies. But so much of those orthodoxies are, like you said, actually predicated on a profoundly conservative and reactionary argument. The nice
They're the
version,
left wing of the old right. Well, if you think of like left and right as the French Assembly, they're the left wing of the old right. So they're about human difference and that sort of thing. Okay, they're left in that sense. But what happened to people who demanded freedom, who believed in the universality of the human? Who believes in that now?
Nobody believes in the universality of anything anymore, apparently. It's all about, it's all about quote unquote justice as opposed to freedom. And that's the problem.
Yeah.
Because what the hell is justice? When people talk about restorative justice, it's like, well, then if somebody murders my wife, I will murder them. Then I've restored it, right? That's restorative justice, right? Like people talk a lot of bullshit about stuff, but like you said, it's about like freedom and emancipation. And I think a lot of people on the left miss that. And that's why people get suckered into kind of the kind version of a kind of like
social pathology, which is just neoliberalism or post-liberalism or whatever you want to call it.
Pretty scary, guys. Well, with that being said, Ashley, anything you want to plug before we bounce besides your book?
So I do the Sublation magazine show every Monday at 5 o'clock UK time or London time. And we have a Patreon attached to that, which is currently our only source of income for our publishing press. So that's what we were Zero Books. And then in a blaze of fury, we became Sublation Press. And we are trying to get off the ground. So if anybody wants to support our work and support what we do, it'd be great if you could sign up to the Patreon or just follow us on YouTube.
Steph, anything coming up? You're going to be talking with Ben about some things. What are you talking with Ben about?
Nothing. We're not doing it this week.
Oh, you're not doing the Ben thing. Well,
we would have been talking about time travel, but maybe...
Wait.
Oh, that's so cool.
This will be coming out after this Sunday. So it is Friday the 7th today when we're recording this. Stefan is not doing something this Sunday, but the following Sunday, maybe time travel. Wait, that's a very good thing. Yeah, Stefan and
Djene. But it's not clear what we'll be talking about then. So
who knows?
I'll be talking about something next Sunday at, what is it? Is it 9 p.m.? Yeah, 9 p.m. UK time.
9 p.m. UK time. 4
on TIR and GTA simultaneously.
There you go. Stefan, now famous podcaster. Okay, guys. Well, thank you so much, Ashley, for coming on. It is always enlightening to discuss with you about how we should all actually be miserable. And with that, we are out.
It is what it is.